Welcome to the Sleep Narrator. I know you use these videos to drift off into slumber, so before you close your eyes, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Also, let me know where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander as I tell you a story. Blueprints for a better life. The cupboard was empty. Again, Jake stood barefoot on the cracked linoleum floor of their tiny kitchen, staring at the lone glass jar that once held pickles. Its brine had long dried to a salty crust. His mother sat at the small table beside him, arms crossed over her thin chest, face turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. His little sister Ellie, only 4, lay curled on the torn sofa with a blanket too small to cover her feet. She hadn't cried today. There wasn't enough energy left for that. Outside, the wind howled through the alleyways of the small town, rattling loose shutters and scraping leaves across the sidewalk. It was late autumn, the time when things should have felt warm and full. But in Jake's house, it was only empty. Their father had left 6 months ago. No note, no goodbye. Just a slowly fading echo and the shadow of a man who couldn't outrun his own disappointments. Their mother worked when she could, scrubbing floors in the high school, taking laundry for neighbors, but jobs came and went like weather in the mountains, unpredictable, harsh. Jake was only 8, but the hunger had aged him. That night, as he lay next to Ellie under a pile of mismatched coats, he stared at the cracked ceiling and made himself a promise. I will never be poor again. Not just a thought, not just a wish, a decision. The kind a boy makes when he sees his mother skip dinner so her children can share one dry crust of bread. The kind a boy makes when he knows that tomorrow might come without mercy. School was Jake's only escape, not because it was warm or welcoming, but because it had a roof and free lunch on Tuesdays. He sat in the back of the classroom, worn shoes tied with string, pencil nubs clutched in calloused fingers. While other kids laughed about cartoons and snacks, Jake paid attention to every word, every lesson, every number. Knowledge, he had decided, was his weapon. He started collecting scraps, magazines from the recycling bin, torn pages from newspapers. Anything that mentioned houses, land, buildings. He didn't know the word for it yet, but it fascinated him. Real estate. He'd walk the edges of town, past abandoned lots and crumbling homes, and imagine what he would build there. Sometimes he'd sketch them out. Big houses with red doors, clean floors, tables full of food. A bedroom for Ellie. Just hers. He never showed them to anyone. Not until he met Mr. Dalton. The old man ran the town's hardware shop. Gruff. Quiet. But he noticed things. One day, he caught Jake looking through the window studying blueprints pinned to a corkboard. You like those? He asked. Jake nodded. You any good with numbers? I'm the best in my class, Jake said without hesitation. Come by Saturday. Sweep the shop. I'll give you some books. And just like that, something shifted. The first thread of luck. Or maybe something better. A beginning. Jake showed up at 7 a.m. sharp. The shop was still dark inside, but Mr. Dalton unlocked the front door without a word and handed Jake a broom and a cloth. It was the first job Jake ever had. He worked like it mattered, because it did. He swept every corner, wiped down shelves, arranged nails and screws until they were perfectly aligned. Mr. Dalton said little, just nodded occasionally and watched with eyes like flint. After 3 hours, Jake's hands were blackened with dust and sweat. Come here, Dalton said. They sat at a small table in the back. Dalton handed him a peanut butter sandwich and a thick binder dog-eared and covered in pencil notes. What's this? Jake asked. Basic construction math, blueprints, property valuation. Read it. Jake took the binder like it was made of gold. That became the rhythm of his Saturdays. Work first. Lessons after. Dalton taught him things that weren't in school. How to read zoning codes, calculate square footage, estimate costs. Jake soaked it all in. Every page, every formula, every anecdote about the old houses in town. Sometimes customers came in who remembered Jake's dad. They'd glance his way, whisper to Dalton. Jake never asked what they said. He didn't need to. He was building something different now. One number, one floor plan, one dust-streaked afternoon at a time. And slowly, week by week, he stopped being hungry. Not in the belly, but in the heart. By the time Jake turned 10, he'd read more about building codes than most adults in town. He still didn't own a proper backpack, but his arms were full every day with borrowed books, hand-me-down folders, and pages copied from library encyclopedias. Each evening after school, he'd spread it all across the kitchen floor, sketching his own diagrams in blue ink from the corner store. His mother watched him silently, sometimes pausing her folding or laundry to hover near, reading upside down. "What is that one?" she asked once. "A duplex, with a shared kitchen. It'd be cheaper to build." She blinked. "And you came up with that?" Jake nodded. "It's for people like us." He didn't know it then, but that was the first time she smiled in months. On Sundays, Jake rode his bike to the edge of town and studied every for sale sign, jotting notes in a dog-eared spiral. He'd learned to decode listings, what was hype and what was truth. He circled vacant lots with chalk and imagined foundation lines. He watched houses being torn down and whispered questions to the bulldozer crews. Dalton started giving him old city maps, and together they'd cross-reference zoning changes with old family names and land values. Jake began to see the town like a skeleton, its bones, its missing pieces, its buried wealth. And yet, he was still a kid. He still scraped his knees, still got into fights, still walked Ellie home from kindergarten with her sticky hand in his... But inside his mind, something bigger was forming. Something vast, something steel frame, a future. And the blue ink on his fingers, it wasn't schoolwork anymore. It was a blueprint for escape. Jake's 11th birthday came and went without cake, without candles, and without presents. But it brought something far more valuable, the beginning of a friendship that would last a lifetime. On that cold November morning, Jake walked into Dalton's shop, like he always did, early, quiet, already thinking about floor plans he'd drawn on napkins the night before. But that morning, another kid was there too. He was lanky, with thick glasses and hair that never seemed to sit right. He was trying to carry a bucket of joint compound that looked like it outweighed him. "Need help?" Jake asked. The kid grunted, dropping the bucket with a heavy thud. "Not unless you've got wheels on your back." Jake smirked. "You knew. I'm Will. My mom's making me help my Uncle Dalton during weekends. Child labor, I think." Jake laughed. "I'm Jake. I've been here a while." They shook hands. And just like that, Jake had his first real friend. Will wasn't like Jake. He didn't know what it meant to miss meals, but he knew what it meant to feel invisible. His parents were always busy, traveling, working, networking. Will was just an accessory in their lives, something polished for photos and forgotten in the hallway. But Will was smart, scary smart. And once he learned that Jake was obsessed with real estate, something sparked between them. "I don't want to build houses," Will said one Saturday, "but I want to design the things inside them. The systems, the code, the automation." "You mean like computers?" "Yeah. One day every home's going to be smarter than its owner." Jake laughed. "Then I'll sell the houses and you'll make them work." It sounded ridiculous at the time, but it was the beginning of their empire. Winter in town was cruel, frost on the windows, steam from the heating grates that hissed like snakes underfoot. Jake's shoes were still tied with string, and he refused a coat from Dalton's charity box, insisting that someone else probably needed it more. Dalton eventually handed him one anyway. "Wear it or I'm calling your mother," he grunted. Jake wore it, not because he needed it, but because for the first time in his life, someone insisted he deserved warmth. By the end of that year, Jake had built his first working model, a scale replica of a two-bedroom starter home made from scrap wood and wire hangers. Will installed battery-powered lighting and a fan rigged from a broken toy drone. They presented it at the school science fair and won second place. The principal smiled, took their photo, and shook their hands. But neither boy cared about the ribbon. On the ride home, Jake turned to Will. We could actually do this, you know? One day. Build it, build it, sell it, change things. Will grinned. Hell yeah, we can. Jake looked out the window, watching as the snow started to fall across the roofs of his crumbling town. He didn't know when or how, but something inside him whispered, "This is the beginning." And it was. A dream was forming. Not a wish, not a hope, a plan. December brought snow, not enough for sledding, just enough to freeze everything that mattered. The town gas station ran out of salt, and the school pipes burst the week before Christmas. For most kids, it was a cause for celebration. For Jake, it was a problem. School being closed meant no lunch on Tuesdays, no warm radiators, no escape from the cold. Ellie had started coughing in her sleep. Their mother did what she could. Hot water bottles made from reused soda containers, an extra blanket borrowed from the neighbor who owed her a favor, but there was only so much she could give. Jake asked Mr. Dalton for extra shifts. Snow doesn't stop nails from rusting. Dalton grumbled, sliding a broom toward him. On Fridays, he started delivering firewood with Will, stacking bundles onto his old bike trailer. Will did the routing, mapping out the quickest loops with colored pencils and a compass he'd gotten from his father's office drawer. They split tips evenly, even when Will insisted Jake should take more. "I'm not doing this for money," Will said. "Then you're doing it wrong," Jake muttered, smiling. On Christmas Eve, Jake made Ellie a wooden music box from salvaged parts. It played a single note when she turned the crank, off-key but stubbornly sweet. She didn't let it go for days. Their mother watched from the kitchen doorway, one hand on her chest, the other holding a chipped mug of tea. "You're turning into someone I don't recognize," she whispered. Jake looked up. Good or bad? She didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. New Year's brought a thaw. Dalton gave them both a battered copy of Rich Dad Poor Dad. "We'll read it in a day." Jake took a week. They underlined sentences, scribbled notes in the margins. "This is what we're doing," Jake said, tapping the page that said, "Assets feed you. Liabilities eat you." They started their own notebook, business ideas. On the first page, flipping abandoned houses. Get one, clean it, sell it. It was more fantasy than planned. But in that dusty back room behind the hardware shop, under flickering lights and the smell of oiled tools, two boys began to believe in something bigger than themselves. They had no capital, no resources, just firewood, forecasts, and the spark of something they wouldn't name until much later. Hunger. By the time spring rolled around, Jake and Will had filled two notebooks. One was bursting with numbers, the other with sketches, ideas, and wish lists. They'd created their own vocabulary, shortcuts, and nicknames for neighborhoods, property types, renovation levels. They treated it like a game. But to Jake, it was life. Their afternoons were spent combing through the town's neglected corners. Every overgrown yard, every boarded-up window was a maybe. They couldn't buy anything, not yet, but Jake believed in preparing like he already owned the map. Then came the moment. Dalton handed Jake a folded sheet of newspaper and tapped the classified section. "Old place out by Bell Creek. Auction. Starting bids low, no reserve." Jake blinked. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because someone ought to teach you how this works before life teaches you the hard way." Will leaned over Jake's shoulder. "You think we should go?" Dalton gave them a long look. "No. I think you should go watch." The Bell Creek house wasn't much to look at. Weather-worn siding, a sagging porch, and a front yard that had surrendered to weeds. But Jake didn't see what it was. He saw what it could be. People gathered in small knots outside, talking in low voices. Mostly men in trucker hats or stained jeans, arms folded, eyes sharp. One woman wore sunglasses and a red scarf, flipping through legal documents. Jake and Will stayed near the back, invisible. The auctioneer stepped onto the porch and began. Starting bid, $1,000. A man raised his hand. One, another, two, 2,500. Jake gripped his notebook. Will jotted notes furiously. At 3,000, The bidding slowed. By 4,500 it stalled. Going once, twice, 5. Someone shouted. Sold. The crowd began to disperse, and Jake turned to leave until he felt a hand on his shoulder. Dalton. You learn anything? Jake nodded. They're not bidding on the house. They're bidding on what it could be. Dalton smiled. Then, you're already ahead of half the people who show up here. That night, Jake stayed up sketching the Bell Creek house from memory. He redrew it 6 different ways: new siding, new steps, new windows. He didn't own it. He might never own it. But in his mind, it was already his. And in a quiet, determined corner of his heart, he promised, one day I won't be watching. One day I'll be bidding and winning. The summer Jake turned 12 was long, hot, and quiet in the way small towns always are when the excitement burns off with the morning fog. School was out. Most of the kids went to summer camps or vacations. Jake went to work. Dalton found extra things for him and Will to do. Organizing the tool shelves, restocking sandpaper, even helping patch the old roof over the back storage shed. Jake didn't complain once. He barely spoke at all when he worked. His mind was too busy figuring out how to make his dream real. He was growing taller, leaner, not quite strong, but wiry. His fingers were stained with pencil lead and dust. He still wore second-hand clothes, but he carried himself with a kind of purpose now, one that most adults couldn't name but respected instinctively. Will, on the other hand, had begun coding simple programs on an old laptop his cousin gave him. Someday I'll automate every house you build, he joked one afternoon. You won't even need light switches. Jake grinned. As long as the roof doesn't leak and the heater works, they'll love it. Their plan was growing, but so was the reality of how far away they were from it. Jake knew money wouldn't fall from the sky, but he'd started hoping it might show up somewhere less impossible. He wrote letters to real estate firms, asked for internships, asked to shadow someone. Anything. Only one wrote back. Not hiring. Try again in 5 years. He posted an ad at the grocery store bulletin board. Yard work, window cleaning, hauling junk. Will work hard. Cheap. He got 2 calls. One from a retired woman with too many dogs, another from a man who needed someone to help clean out a shed he hadn't opened in 10 years. Jake did it all. Will helped sometimes, especially when it involved tech or wiring. They never made more than $20 a job, but Jake didn't care. Every dollar went into a tin box under his bed, labeled in crooked marker, the first house. Dalton found out about it eventually. You saving up for your first house? He asked, trying to sound casual. Jake just nodded. Dalton scratched his chin. Most folks save for a car first. I don't want a car, Jake said. I want something that grows. Dalton didn't laugh. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wrinkled $10 bill. Then add this. Consider it investment capital. Jake blinked. You serious? Dead serious.
And when the time comes, I expect a return.
Jake took it with both hands. That night, he opened the tin box and placed the bill on top like it was a crown. He counted everything again. $62.17. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it was growing. Jake's hands had learned a new language. Not just the feel of a hammer or the rhythm of sweeping, but the quiet understanding of weight, measure, and time. He could look at a room and tell you how many square feet of flooring it needed. He could estimate paint by instinct and lumber by memory. Dalton noticed. You've got builder's eyes, he said one afternoon, watching Jake measure out 2x4s with a worn yellow tape. Not just hands. That's rare. Jake shrugged, but the words stayed with him for days. Will, meanwhile, had graduated from basic code to working with old smart plugs and timers. He was trying to wire an abandoned lamp in Dalton's back room to turn on via a remote switch. It took him 3 weeks and 5 electrical shocks. Jake watched him, half amused, half amazed. You ever think about quitting? He asked one evening. All the time, Will said, grinning. But what else am I going to do? Be normal? Jake chuckled. That ship sailed. Their friendship had deepened, no longer built just on dreams, but on trust. When Jake's mom had to work nights at the diner, Will brought over his old boombox so Jake and Ellie could fall asleep to music. When Will's parents left town for a weekend, Jake stayed with him so the house didn't feel so big. They were two sides of a strange coin, but together they were sharper, stronger. That fall, Dalton let Jake help on a real project. The Bakers, an older couple, needed help fixing up their back porch before the winter rains came. It was rotting, sagging, and more nails than wood. Jake worked under Dalton's guidance, replacing beams, sanding rails, painting trim. When they finished, Mrs. Baker hugged him. "You're going to build something amazing someday," she said. Jake smiled. "I already am." He didn't mean the porch. He meant the life he was shaping. One nail, one number, one long day at a time. Winter came early. The rain was heavier than usual, cold seeping through the seams of the town like water through old roof shingles. Jake's jacket was too thin, his boots too worn, but he kept showing up at Dalton's workshop every morning like clockwork. Dalton handed him a thick, rolled-up sheet one morning. "Blueprints," he said. "You're ready." Jake unrolled them with reverence. It was a small shed, simple, square, functional, but it was his to build. From scratch, Will helped him design the wiring. Ellie helped him paint the name the corner bench. It took all winter, nights by lamplight, weekends after school, and when it was done, Dalton handed Jake a key. "Your first build," he said. "You earned it." Jake stood in the doorway of the tiny shed, heart thudding. Not because of the walls, because of what they meant. This wasn't just wood. This was proof that he could start from nothing and build something real. The shed stood behind Dalton's workshop like a badge pinned to the earth. Cold winter mornings brought frost to the roof, but Jake arrived early each day to sweep it clear. Dalton, impressed, gave him a new task: build shelving from reclaimed wood. Measure, cut, fit, finish. Jake worked like he was carving his future into every grain. Word spread. By February, Dalton had 3 new clients. One of them asked, casually, if Jake could handle a solo build. A garden fence. Jake said yes before Dalton could speak. It was crooked. It was uneven. But it stood. He rebuilt it twice that spring. By the 3rd time, the posts were straight, and the homeowner paid him $50. Jake went home that night and hid the cash in a jar beneath his mattress. Ellie found it and added a $10 bill from her tips at the bakery. "For when you build the real thing," she said. Will's project grew too. He had figured out how to automate an old space heater to kick on 10 minutes before they got home from school. Then he wired a light sensor to trigger a recording of Ellie's favorite song when the sun hit the porch at a certain angle. "It's not much," he said. "It's magic," Ellie whispered. Will didn't smile often, but that day he did. One Friday afternoon, Dalton took Jake on a drive. They passed the edges of town, the empty lots, the places developers forgot. At a cleared patch of dirt near the train yard, he parked. "This was mine," Dalton said. "Before I gave up." Jake looked around. "Why'd you stop?" "Life got loud, I got tired, and the world changed faster than I could keep up." Jake nodded slowly. "I won't stop," he said. Dalton chuckled. "No, I don't think you will." He handed Jake a second set of blueprints. A cabin, 2 rooms, a front porch, a dream in ink. Jake studied the lines like scripture, not because of what it was, but because of what it could be. Spring brought change like thunder, loud, sudden, and unavoidable. The town thawed, and with it came opportunity. Jake picked up weekend work with a handyman crew, patching roofs, sanding decks, learning the difference between shortcuts and craftsmanship. The men were rough, but they respected work ethic, and Jake earned his place. He wasn't the kid anymore. He was becoming a builder. After each job, he wrote in a small black notebook what he learned, what he'd do differently, what tools worked best. He kept it in his jacket like a second wallet. Dalton noticed. You building something in there? He asked one afternoon. Jake nodded. My head. I want to remember how this all felt before it starts feeling like just work. Dalton clapped his shoulder. You're smarter than you look. Will, meanwhile, hit a wall. His laptop died. His code glitched. He lost 2 weeks of work in a single corrupted file. Jake found him at the library. Head down, fists clenched. I'm done, Will said. No, you're not, Jake replied. You just forgot what you're chasing. Will looked up. And what's that? Jake smiled. The same thing I am. A way out. They went to Dalton's that night and stayed up building a hand crank generator, something Jake had read about in a book. Will wired it to a USB outlet. It worked. Barely, but it worked. Will laughed, pure and unfiltered, for the first time in weeks. Ellie had her own spark. She applied for a summer art residency at a university 2 hours away. She painted for hours in the basement, music echoing through the vents. When the letter came, she cried silently on the porch. She was accepted. Jake hugged her tight. You earned this, Ellie nodded through tears. But what if I lose what I have here? You won't, he said. You'll carry it with you. And somehow, he believed. Because if they all chased what set them on fire, maybe, just maybe, the world would catch too. The week Ellie left, the house felt too quiet. Jake avoided the porch, the basement, even the chair she always curled into when she read. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like the shape of her still lingered in the air, and he wasn't ready to exhale. Will stayed over more often, sleeping on the floor beside Jake's bed with wires and gadgets strewn between them. One night, unable to sleep, they walked to the edge of town. The road there wound past empty lots, broken fences, places they used to ride bikes when they were too small to reach the pedals. You ever wonder if we'll make it out? Jake asked. Will didn't answer right away. Then, every day. But wondering ain't the same as trying. They sat in the gravel shoulder for over an hour talking about what they'd build, where they'd live, who they'd help if they ever had more than enough. It wasn't a plan, but it was a beginning. A letter arrived from Ellie, handwritten, smudged with charcoal. Inside was a sketch of the two of them standing in front of a building with big glass windows and a crooked sign that read, Brothers and Brushes. Jake pinned it to the wall above his bed. Dalton saw it and nodded. Looks like someone drew the future. Jake smiled. She always does. That summer ended slower than it started. Work picked up. Jake saved nearly $200. Will finished his first full home automation prototype, and Ellie returned with new canvases, new freckles, and a laugh that sounded lighter. They weren't rich. They weren't out. But they were ready. Because the road between where they'd been and where they wanted to go was long, cracked, and still stretching. But they were walking it. Together. Fall arrived with wind in its lungs and grit in its teeth. The leaves turned quicker this year, and the air sharpened like it had something to prove. Jake took on more jobs, fixing porches, rehanging doors, digging fence posts. Every day after school, he changed out of dusty jeans only to pull them back on again after dinner. He stopped using gloves. His palms toughened. Dalton handed him a small wooden box one evening. Inside were tools, old but sturdy, engraved with Dalton's initials. You've outgrown mine, he said simply. Jake swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Say you'll build something better than I ever did. Will had built something too, a crude housing unit for a string of modular batteries, enough to power an entire shed off-grid. When he showed it to Jake, he laughed. This ain't pretty, Jake grinned. Neither is my hammer swing. They tested it on the corner bench, their shed from last winter. Lights flickered on. A fan buzzed. The outlet hummed like promise. Will looked at the glow and whispered, That's freedom. Jake nodded. And that's how we'll get out. Not all at once. One circuit at a time. Ellie had enrolled in online art classes, juggling 2 jobs and paint-stained sketchbooks. She sent them home one by one, signed only with the letter E. One day, Jake found Will staring at one of them, a charcoal outline of the town, drawn from a rooftop. Empty streets stretched like quiet arteries. She gets it, Will said. This place. The weight of it. Jake placed the drawing in his notebook. Some blueprints were made of graphite, some of dreams, and some, like theirs, were drawn from bent nails and borrowed time. Winter came in hard, like it was angry. Wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. Pipes froze. The wood stove Jake patched last spring barely held the chill back. He started sleeping in his work clothes, just to save time. Dalton closed the shop for 2 weeks. Repairs, he said, but Jake knew better. Business was thin. Even reliable hands couldn't keep the cold from creeping into the books. Jake filled the gap however he could. Odd jobs, clearing driveways, hauling wood. He built a wooden ramp for a neighbor in a wheelchair. No pay, but word spread. He didn't care. Each new project was one more brick in the wall he was building against the world. Ellie's hours got cut at the bakery. She started taking weekend bus rides to the city to help paint theater backdrops for a community college she hadn't even applied to yet. She came home tired, fingers stained with more color than sleep. Jake stayed up to meet her one night. "You okay?" She nodded. "The work's heavy, but the view's bigger." He didn't know exactly what she meant, but it sounded like hope. Will hit a streak of wins. He entered a local science fair with his battery grid, took second place, then got a call from a guy in Sacramento who saw his blog. "Wants me to demo it," Will said, stunned. "Like, for real?" Jake clapped him on the back. "You're getting out." Will's smile flickered. "Not without you." Jake looked down. "You might have to." "No," Will said. "I won't." And the way he said it, it felt like a promise. That February, Jake turned 16. He didn't tell anyone. Just worked. Just built. But Ellie found out. She and Will surprised him with a framed blueprint. Their shed, the corner bench, rendered in clean ink and thick paper. On the back was a single line written in Ellie's handwriting. "The future starts with the tools you pick up today." Jake hung it above his bed. Then he went outside, under the frozen sky, and stared up until his eyes watered. Not from the cold, but because he could finally see something above the weight. A future, and he wasn't carrying it alone. Spring returned like a memory, soft at first, then loud with color. Jake took a job helping pour foundation for a new community center 2 towns over. It meant early mornings and long bus rides, but it also meant real money. The crew was older, sharper, less forgiving. But Jake didn't flinch. He learned how to smooth concrete by eye, how to brace for weather, how to listen more than he spoke. By April, they let him lead a section. The slab was solid. So was Jake. Will kept chasing code. The Sacramento contact offered him a remote internship, unpaid but full of access. He jumped at it, even if it meant hours on library Wi-Fi and a cracked borrowed laptop. One night, Jake found him asleep on the floor of the shed, keyboard under his hands, screen glowing. Jake didn't wake him. "Some work you don't interrupt." Ellie announced she'd been accepted into the city college's design program. "I'll be commuting," she said. "It's cheaper, but I'll be in the room." Jake hugged her. "You belong in every room you walk into." She smiled. "Then I'll make room for you too." May came with lightning. A storm knocked out power across town. Will's system, the battery grid from the shed, was the only thing still running on their block. Neighbors brought food, candles, radios. Jake helped hang blankets in doorways to keep heat in. And for one night, their tiny community leaned on them. It was the first time Jake realized, maybe getting out wasn't the only kind of winning. Maybe building where you are counted too. June arrived with heat and the promise of graduation echoing through every hallway. Jake wasn't walking with the others. Too many missed credits from the years he worked instead of studied. But no one asked. And he didn't explain. Instead, he worked. Dalton connected him to a contractor out by the lake who needed hands on a summer house. It paid well, long hours, longer commutes. Jake took it without blinking. Each board he laid, each screw he drove, it wasn't just a house. It was distance from what they used to be. Will's internship became more than digital. He was invited to pitch his energy model at a startup conference in the city. They offered a stipend, a hotel, a name badge that said Innovator. "You're going to be famous," Jake joked. Will grinned. "I just want to be useful." Ellie painted his badge into a mural she was building for the library's children's wing. Bright colors, honest light, hope in acrylic. "You're all gonna leave," she said one night, on the porch. Jake shook his head. "We're just gonna lift higher. Same roots, bigger sky." Jake counted every dollar that summer. Saved enough to consider something he hadn't dared. Renting a space. A real one. Not a shed, not a loaned garage, but something with a window and a sign. He ran the numbers, then ran them again. It wasn't enough, but it was close. That night, he emptied the jar beneath his bed, spread every coin across the floor. It still wasn't enough, but he smiled, because he was almost there. And for the first time in his life, almost didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a beginning. It came in a white envelope with no return address. The stamp was crooked, the handwriting sharp and unfamiliar. Jake opened it slowly, half expecting a bill. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, "To whom it may concern, we've heard about your work. We'd like to talk." Enclosed is a number. "Call it when you're ready." A friend of the future. Jake stared at it. No business name. No signature. Just the number. He passed it to Will. Will raised an eyebrow. "What do you think?" "I think it's a test." Will smiled. "Then let's pass it." They called from a payphone on 3rd and Vine. The voice that answered was clipped, professional, and curious. They asked Jake about his designs, asked Will about his energy model, asked if they were willing to show up and show proof. "Proof of what?" Jake asked. "That you're not afraid of change," the voice replied. They gave a date, a location, and then hung up. The place was 3 towns east, an industrial park surrounded by fencing and faded billboards. They brought a model, a plan, and a pitch. It wasn't polished, but it was real. A man in a button-down shirt listened, took notes, asked questions that made Jake sweat. Then, without warning, he smiled. "You two aren't what we expected." Jake and Will looked at each other. "That's kind of the point," Will said. They didn't get a contract that day, but they left with something louder. A door open. A name to call. And the first business card Jake had ever held with his own fingers. He folded it neatly and tucked it into the notebook. Not just as a memory, but as a foundation stone. The next few weeks blurred. Jake and Will split their time between odd jobs and late-night planning. They revisited old sketches, rebuilt models, and worked out costs with the precision of 2 boys used to counting every dime. Then, without asking permission, they started fixing up the empty garage behind Dalton's shop. They swept out leaves, patched the roof, scraped years of paint off the windows. Ellie showed up with brushes and buckets. "You're going to need branding," she said. Jake smirked. "We're not even open." "You will be." She painted a logo on the side wall, a stylized house resting on a pencil and circuit wire. Beneath it, in block letters, "Foundation." Jake stared at it for a long time. Will whispered, "It's real now." Jake just nodded. They printed flyers. Nothing fancy, just a name, a phone number, and a line of promise. Custom builds, honest hands, from blueprint to switchboard. They passed them around town, pinned them at the diner, left stacks at the hardware store. It wasn't long before the first call came. A retired couple needed a ramp and garden path rebuilt before the rainy season. Jake quoted low. Will mapped an efficient supply run. They finished in 4 days. Under budget, with a smile. The couple paid in cash and hugs. Jake bought them all burgers after. And for the first time, the 3 of them sat in a booth and didn't talk about getting out. They talked about staying and building up. Because maybe roots weren't chains. Maybe they were anchors, and maybe the thing you're running from can become the thing you stand on. The next project came from a single mom named Teresa, who had 2 kids, a leaky kitchen, and a dream of turning her small back porch into a screened-in sunroom. She didn't have much, but she offered a modest budget and warm coffee. Jake and Will took it without hesitation. They framed the structure by hand. Ellie helped Teresa's daughter paint flower murals on the plywood walls. It wasn't the biggest job, but it was the first time someone called them a business out loud. "You boys work like craftsmen," Teresa said. Jake smiled. "We're trying to earn that word." They started tracking everything. Expenses, materials, time spent. Jake built a spreadsheet. Will refined it into an app prototype. Ellie mocked up a logo redesign with softer edges and brighter lines. Every night they reviewed it all. On paper, in sketches, through conversation. And somewhere between calculations and scrapwood, they started dreaming a little bigger. "What if we pitch the city?" Will asked one night. "There's grant money, youth startups, green building funds." Jake was hesitant, but Ellie wasn't. She helped them write a proposal. By the end of the week, Foundation had its first formal pitch deck. Not perfect, but solid. And like everything else they built, it stood up. The pitch to the city took place in a repurposed elementary school gym. Paint peeling, overhead lights buzzing like flies. Jake wore his cleanest boots. Will brought the prototype and a laptop that wheezed when it booted. Ellie dressed them with confidence alone. 7 other groups were in the lineup. Most were older, more polished. They had charts and matching polos and voices that didn't crack. Jake's hands shook when he took the mic, but when he started talking about building with your hands when your pockets are empty, about designing for people who couldn't afford mistakes, he stopped shaking. Will followed with the tech, Ellie with the vision. Together they looked like possibility in denim and dreams. After the last pitch, they waited outside. The sky cracked open with rain. Jake didn't have an umbrella. None of them did. They just stood there, laughing like they'd already won. They didn't. Not that day. The grant went to a clean energy co-op from across the county. More experience, better reach. But a woman from the panel found them before they left. "You're not what this town is used to," she said. "But I hope you don't." She handed Jake a card. City Renewal Initiative. Pilot funding, 90. Smaller. Stricter. But a door. Jake held the card like it was more than contact info. It was a key, and he was finally ready to build the lock that fit it. They spent the next 3 days in Will's garage, planning like the world was about to open. Ellie taped sketches to the wall, solar roof kits, modular greenhouses, prefab walls designed to reduce waste. Jake ordered reclaimed wood samples. Called Dalton, ran the numbers again. Will coded through the nights. Ellie rewrote the pitch. Jake built a tiny model in cardboard and foam. They missed meals, forgot sleep, skipped everything but the dream. It didn't feel like hustle. It felt like movement, like a door swinging open into light. And for the first time, they didn't wonder if they belonged at the table. They were already building their own. The pilot funding came through a week later. $10,000. A small number on paper, but massive in their world. It came with stipulations, quarterly updates, a scope limit, city inspections, and a final report. But it was theirs. Jake stood outside the garage, staring at the check like it might dissolve. "We're going to stretch every penny," Ellie said. "We're going to turn it into something they can't ignore," Jake answered. They picked their project carefully, a vacant lot behind the public library, city-owned, long forgotten. The plan was to build a single-room learning space, a pop-up classroom with solar panels, rain catchment, and modular walls that could be folded and moved. It was bold, small, but different. Jake mapped it. Will modeled it. Ellie made it beautiful. They named it the Seed Box. By day, they worked with Dalton, sourcing reclaimed materials. By night, they camped out in the garage, fingers stained with ink and glue, eyes red from backlit plans. Dalton helped where he could. So did Teresa, who brought food and talked logistics. Even the librarian offered help, offering to use the space once it opened. Everyone gave something, but Jake, he gave everything. Halfway through, rain came again. They lost half the panels to water damage. A delivery fell through. They had to redesign the wall system from scratch. Jake almost broke. He stood in the mud, hair soaked, blueprint, bleeding ink in his hands. "We can stop," Will said. "Start smaller." Jake looked up slowly. "Or finish louder." Ellie placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then, let's shout." On day 83, the seed box stood. Glass front, painted sides, solar roof, wooden steps built from 5 kinds of scrap. Inside, one table, a long bench, and sunlight where the ceiling curved clear. They invited the city. The inspectors came. So did neighbors, parents, kids, and the woman from the grant committee. She stepped inside, ran her hand along the bench, nodded, then smiled. "You didn't just build it," she said. "You made it matter." Jake exhaled. And for the first time in his life, he believed it. Jake returned to the seed box 2 days after the ribbon cutting. Alone. No crowd. No cameras. Just him. A thermos of coffee, and the echo of something permanent. He sat on the bench they built from old barnwood and breathed in the quiet. Outside, the street was waking up. Buses, birds, the creak of an early jogger's steps. But inside it was still, but not empty. He touched the table, ran his fingers along the grain. Thought of all the times he'd stood in a half-built frame, wondering if anything they did would last. This did. Not forever, but long enough. Will was already sketching version 2. Bigger, cleaner energy loop. Detachable roof for heat control. He showed Jake the plans that night over ramen noodles. "It's not just one box anymore," Will said. "It's a kit. We could build them anywhere." Jake nodded. "Let's test the idea, find another lot. And if we can't, then we build one anyway." Ellie got an invitation to show her seed box sketches in a regional art exhibit. Her first official gallery wall. Jake watched her prepare, mounting each sketch with care, her hands never quite steady until she stepped back and saw the whole picture. "It's strange," she said, "to hang something you built with your hands on a wall and call it art." Jake smiled. "Everything we build is art. We just don't always frame it." The town started whispering. About the 3 kids who made a classroom out of a junk lot. About the librarian who hosted daily story hour there now. About the teenagers who might be onto something. And for once, the whispers didn't sound like warnings. They sounded like momentum. The seed box stood for more than function now. It had become a symbol, a flag planted in the middle of a town that had long forgotten how to believe in young hands. Jake sat in a meeting with 2 city council members and a school principal the following week. They wanted more, not just copies of the seed box, but expansion, community gardens, tool libraries, mobile workshops, and they wanted Foundation to lead it. "You're still technically not incorporated," one councilwoman said. Jake smiled. "We're still technically 17. She laughed. "Start the paperwork. We'll draft the letters." Will launched a basic website. Ellie created a logo that looked like a tree built from planks. Jake wrote a mission statement that made Dalton tear up. They opened a tiny bank account, filed for nonprofit status, printed business cards that didn't look perfect but felt real. Jake slipped one into his wallet, next to the photo of his mom. That weekend, the 3 of them built a second seed box in the yard behind the church. The pastor watched quietly, then brought out lemonade. "It's not just the kids you're helping," he said. "It's the whole story of this place." Jake looked at Will, then at Ellie. And in that moment he understood something. They hadn't just changed what the town thought of them. They were changing what the town thought of itself. Summer turned dry, golden, the kind of weather where everything seemed to hum, cicadas in the trees, hammers in the air, possibility in the silence. Jake stood on the site of their next build, an empty lot beside the community rec center. The ground was hard-packed clay, littered with trash and sun-bleached flyers. But in his mind, he saw beams. He saw skylights. He saw color. The project was bigger, riskier. They were applying for state funding now, writing proposals that felt more like business plans than dreams. And Jake found himself wondering, had they become something real? Or were they still kids trying to prove a point? Will didn't seem to question it. He spent his nights debugging the second generation of the off-grid hub. Ellie took on commissioned mural work from 2 towns over, painting their story in giant color. And Jake? He carried the plans. In a folder. In his head. In his hand. One morning, Jake visited Dalton. The old man sat beneath a tarp in his yard, polishing a chisel. "You look like someone who's carrying a whole town," he said. Jake shrugged. "Feels like it some days." Dalton studied him. "The trick isn't lifting it. It's teaching others how to hold it with you." Jake sat with that for a long while. Then he stood, shook Dalton's hand, and said, "I think it's time we built something that outlives us." Dalton nodded. "Then don't forget the roots." Jake didn't. Not then. Not ever. The state funding came through, conditional, lean, and wrapped in enough paperwork to bury a small town. But it came, and with it a new kind of momentum. Jake, Will, and Ellie stood together in what used to be a parking lot. Now it was a blueprint come to life in their imaginations. A multi-use space with workshops, classrooms, and a greenhouse roof powered by Will's off-grid energy system. This wasn't just a project anymore. It was infrastructure. It was a statement. Jake led daily meetings with volunteers. Ellie coordinated with city planners. Will was now in talks with a tech startup looking to sponsor their green systems. They worked 16-hour days, built through blisters, forgot birthdays, skipped weekends. But every board nailed, every wire run, brought more people into the orbit of what they were doing. They weren't building for recognition. They were building for permanence. The stress cracked them sometimes. Jake snapped at Will over a missed shipment. Ellie went quiet for 2 days when a supplier backed out. Will shut his laptop in frustration and didn't open it again for 40. But every time, they came back. Not because it was easy, but because they remembered who they were before this. They remembered the porch light Jake fixed with borrowed tools. The first ramp Will wired for auto lighting. Ellie's mural of the cracked town road that everyone now called beautiful. They remembered the weight they carried. And why it mattered. By the time the final panels slid into place on the greenhouse roof, it wasn't just theirs anymore. The mayor showed up. 2 local reporters covered it. A youth group from another town asked if they could tour it. Jake stood on the roof, sun setting behind him, and looked down at what they'd built. It wasn't just a building. It was the beginning of a new town story. And this time, they were writing it with bricks. The project had given the town new breath, but it came at a price. Jake barely slept. Will stopped attending their planning breakfasts. Ellie withdrew into her art, painting in silence, her hands moving faster than her voice, the pressure to expand, to meet the city's rising expectations, to do more with the same few hands. It cracked the foundation of their friendship. One evening, as the wind pushed dust through the half-framed annex, Jake and Will finally broke. "You're doing too much," Will snapped. "I'm doing what needs to be done," Jake shot back. "You're burning it down to prove a point." Jake didn't respond. He looked away at the walls, at the unfinished wires, at the place that used to be just theirs. "You forgot why we started this," Will said, his voice low. "It wasn't for city grants or mayors or press. It was for the ones like us." Jake stared at him. "Then help me remember." Will left without answering. Ellie stepped in to patch the silence. She took over project communications, drew flyers, met with local schools, kept the thing from unraveling while the 2 of them figured out how to speak again. And slowly, she made them look at each other differently. Not just as teammates, but as tired, overgrown kids trying to carry something bigger than they'd ever planned for. One night, Jake found Will outside the greenhouse. "I don't want to lose you," Jake said. "You haven't," Will replied. "You just stopped seeing me." They didn't hug. They didn't cry, but they got back to work. And when they rewired the annex wall together, neither of them had to say it. This was the start of their rebuild. Weeks after the annex was finished, Jake sat alone one night with a notebook and a cup of cold coffee, lit only by a bulb hanging from the ceiling beam. Across from him sat Ellie and Will, both quiet, watching him scratch out ideas between long pauses of thought. They were planning their next big move, this time with intention. No more chasing grants, no more stretching themselves thin. This time, they would scale with soul. Jake drew a new kind of seed box, meant for rural schools with no access to stable infrastructure. Ellie proposed it come with an art wall that students could repaint every semester. Will envisioned a compact version of his energy system that could run entirely on repurposed bike generators and solar tiles. "What if," Jake said, circling the sketch, "we send these where no one expects to get something new?" Will grinned. "Like mailing blueprints to the future." Ellie nodded. "Let's call it that." That month, they wrote 50 letters. Each one was hand-addressed to a different corner of the country. Libraries, tribal schools, aftercare programs, shelters. Each one included a letter, a drawing, and a question. "Would you build this with us?" They expected silence. They got replies. Slowly, then, all at once. A retired teacher in Arizona, a youth center in Detroit, a principal from a town in Maine who had heard about them from a cousin and couldn't believe what she saw. And suddenly, Jake wasn't dreaming about just his block or his town. He was dreaming in regions. At the end of that summer, they packed their first out-of-state kit. Jake hugged Dalton before leaving. "You're doing what I never dared," Dalton said. Jake smiled. "Because you made me believe it was possible." Then they hit the road. 3 kids, 1 blueprint, and a map scribbled with names of places no one had cared about in too long. But they did. They cared deeply. Enough to carry the future with them. Enough to build it wherever the letters landed. They returned 5 weeks later. Dust still on their boots, stories folded in the pages of their sketchbooks and receipts. Everywhere they went, something had changed. Not just in the people they met, but in themselves. Jake had learned how to delegate. Will had discovered a knack for speaking to crowds. Ellie had started a visual diary that was already drawing attention from a local arts collective. The seed box was no longer just an idea. It was a movement. They built 4 units in 3 states, each one different, adapted to what the people needed, not just what they had brought. They learned to listen better, to slow down, to ask first. And they learned that the most powerful thing they could offer wasn't their tools or blueprints. It was belief. When they rolled back into town, they were met not with banners or cameras, but with nods, with doors held open, with a kind of quiet respect that comes only when you've done the work and asked for nothing. Dalton was waiting with a folded tarp and a cup of hot coffee. "World didn't fall apart while you were gone," he said, "but it sure looked emptier." Jake smiled. "We brought some things back." They unpacked new tools, new sketches, new names, teachers, builders, youth mentors who wanted to partner on the next wave. The garage-turned-hub wasn't big enough anymore, so they set their sights on the old train depot, abandoned, full of broken glass and potential. Ellie painted the words "foundation" across the peeling wall. Will climbed the roof to map where the solar tiles would go. Jake walked through the station with a flashlight and a slow, steady smile. It was big, cracked, drafty, and perfect. Because some places aren't broken, they're just waiting to be built again. And some kids don't just grow up, they grow a future. The first day in the depot felt like stepping into a forgotten cathedral. Dust floated in thick beams of light through shattered windows. Steel rails gleamed in places beneath broken floorboards, whispering the weight of history. Jake set his toolbox down on the platform. "We'll need a full gut, electrical, plumbing, structural reinforcement. Everything." Will nodded. "And a way to keep heat from escaping through that Swiss cheese roof." Ellie circled the perimeter, already sketching over the air with her finger. "We'll turn this place into a beacon." They didn't wait. Over the next weeks, The station became a storm of progress and chaos. Volunteers arrived in twos and threes, some local, some from places the seed box had touched. A retired rail worker, a high school woodshop teacher, a group of college kids who showed up with nothing but gloves and grit. Every wall rebuilt was a memory honored. Every beam lifted was a name carried. They created co-working spaces for community programs, tool-sharing lockers for tradespeople, a rotating wall of youth-led art that changed every season. Upstairs, they built bunks for overnight programs and tiny apartments for out-of-town volunteers. They didn't just restore the station, they repurposed it. On opening day, the town turned out. There were no speeches, no ribbon cutting. Instead, Ellie painted a single line in bold across the west wall. "This is what happens when we believe in each other." And beneath it, she signed all their names. Jake, Will, Ellie, Dalton, and over 100 others. Not in order, not by title, just as people who chose to build and keep building. After the station opened, the idea spread like a fuse catching wind. Requests began to flow in, not just for builds, but for the blueprint itself. Towns wanted to replicate the system. Educators wanted to use it as curriculum. Local governments called asking for consultations. Jake, Will, and Ellie sat around the repurposed ticket booth one late evening, papers spread out like wings across the table. "We can't be everywhere," Ellie said. "We don't have to," Jake replied. "We can teach people how to build it themselves." So they started documenting everything. Ellie filmed walkthroughs, Will coded an open-source tool. Jake wrote a guidebook titled "Build from Where You Stand." It was part philosophy, part instruction manual, and fully theirs. They released it online for free. Within a month, it had been downloaded in 6 countries. They partnered with a nonprofit in Oregon, then a housing cooperative in South Carolina, then a refugee shelter in Greece. They no longer built buildings. They built builders. The depot became the beating heart of something borderless, and yet they always returned home to the same streets, the same coffee, the same cracked sidewalks where it all began. One night, Jake stood in the very spot where the first seed box had been placed, now weathered but still standing. A little girl sat reading under the solar light. She looked up at him and said, "Did you build this?" Jake smiled. "A long time ago." She nodded. "I want to build one too." He knelt beside her. "Then I'll show you how." The depot was full, too full if you asked Will. They'd outgrown even their biggest space. The projects had expanded. Mobile greenhouses, community solar kits, workshops hosted in half a dozen languages. Jake spent his days coordinating regional programs. Ellie ran design clinics for youth artists and architects. Will was in constant demand, pulled into panels and tech labs across the country. But one afternoon, they canceled everything. They gathered in the original shed, the one behind Dalton's, barely standing but still there. "I missed this," Ellie said, sitting on the crooked bench. Will smiled. "It's good to remember where your heartbeat started." Jake opened a notebook. One of the first inside were names, projects, failures, victories. "We've taught hundreds to build," Jake said. "But what if we focused on just a few, really mentored them?" Will leaned forward. "You mean a fellowship?" "A legacy," Ellie added. So they did. They called it the Builders Circle. They chose 10 kids from 10 different towns, some familiar, some brand new. They brought them to the depot for 6 months, housed them, trained them, and then sent them home, not with finished projects, but with conviction. In one dusty town, a girl named Ava built a library inside a shipping container. In another, a boy named Raj created a bicycle-powered classroom. One by one, the next generation took the torch. And Jake, standing on the depot's rooftop one morning at sunrise, looked out over a town transformed, not just by tools, not by walls, but by belief that started small and kept going. Years passed, but the story didn't fade. It just deepened. The original team took on new roles. Jake became the quiet leader of something global, traveling less, speaking more, guiding new teams with his presence more than his plans. Ellie opened a foundation for creative infrastructure, combining public art with functional design. Will launched a startup focused on sustainable microgrids and then gave the tech away. The depot never emptied. It expanded. A second depot opened in the Midwest, then one in Nairobi. By year 10, Foundation wasn't just a name. It was a model, a movement, a network held together by belief and built on stories like Jake's. And yet, Jake still visited the shed. He'd sit on that same warped bench, sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes with a new builder in training beside him. And he'd always say the same thing. Start small. Build deep. Share everything. One day, he carved it into the inside of the shed wall and left his hammer there, on a hook, not as a farewell, but as a welcome, because someone else would need it next, and the building would never stop. Years later, the shed still stood. The wood was warped. The door hung a little looser. The initials Jake once carved into the beam had faded, but they hadn't vanished. Neither had the idea. Foundation had grown into a constellation of workshops, training hubs, and local collectives, all independent, all connected by a single thread. Start small, build deep, share everything. Ellie's mural still decorated the side of the old train depot. Will's software powered emergency shelters across 2 continents. And Jake, older now, rarely spoke at events. But when he did, he always ended the same way. If you're waiting for permission, this is it. Back in the town where it all began, a new kid walked into the shed for the first time, eyes wide, heart full, and found the hammer on the wall. The story wasn't about where it ended. It was about who picked it up next. Because the best foundations aren't built for one lifetime. They're built so the next one doesn't have to start from nothing.